You seek the key, but first you must learn the ways of precision, craft, and performance with Acura's all-electric ZDX. With a premium Bang & Olufsen sound system, up to a 313-mile range, and a Type S variant with an estimated 500 horsepower, the ZDX is their most powerful SUV yet. Unlock the energy when you visit Acura.com to order yours today.
Go spread the word. When you get a fresh, hot McCrispy from McDonald's and you can feel the heat coming through the bag, don't try to wait till you get home. Always respect hot chicken. The McCrispy, only at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
The year of living constitutionally. Well, I told you this episode would happen when we did the episode with AJ last week, but this is a book by AJ Jacobs, The Year of Living Constitutionally, where he not only researched and wrote about the Constitution, and I learned so many things I had no idea about, but he lived life for a year as if he was in 1790, living the life, word for word, literally, of the U.S. Constitution. And he carried a musket around. He applied to be a pirate in Congress because, if you did not know, in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, it gives Congress the power to make pirates and so many other things. There's so many facts, debates, information, what sort of new powers the Supreme Court took, Congress took, the president took. What's the pros and cons of states' rights versus federal rights? What's the reason for this amendment, that amendment? There's so many things I didn't know about. And of course, the debates about the Electoral College. So and AJ not only researched it, like I said, he lived it. And I did a podcast last week about the AJ method, a very unique method of living the story so that you could, and it turns out to be a great formula to make bestsellers. And now he applies his humor, his talent, his information to the U.S. Constitution, the year of living constitutionally, one man's humble quest to follow the Constitution's original meaning. And here's my good friend, AJ Jacobs.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
First off, I do have to ask, how are things going? All good?
Overall, pretty good. Overall, I'd say 51% positive, which is all that I can ask for.
What's negative?
My parents are old and my kids are applying to college, which I know you say they shouldn't do. So that would solve things. That would be happy. How about you? How are you overall? 51?
Good. Yeah, everything's good. I actually want to ask your advice on something, but I'll do it another time. It's a writing question of all.
Oh, I would love to answer. Well, I can do it later this afternoon or tomorrow.
Or we should do a Zoom lunch sometime.
I'm ready.
Yeah. All right. I'll reach out next week and we'll schedule something.
Perfect.
We got to get your book out. We got to get your book released first.
God bless you.
So AJ, the year of living constitutionally, from the man who wrote The Year of Living Biblically and many other, we talked about this before, but I love your whole style of experiencing things rather than just researching things.
Well, thank you. I do. I love to, it's sort of a method writer. I like to immerse myself and live the topic.
Yeah, like when you wrote The Year of Living Biblically, which is like your classic example of this, and then you have My Year Eating Healthy. I forget the exact title, but
right.
You Year of Living Biblically, you describe some of the things you did.
Yeah, no, I went hardcore. I decided to follow every rule in the Bible as literally as possible. So I did the famous ones, like the 10 Commandments, but there are hundreds of other more obscure ones. So I couldn't wear clothes made of 2 different kinds of fabrics. That's forbidden according to the Old Testament.
Why is that forbidden according to the Old Testament?
Well,
there's usually some reason.
Well, no one really knows. I mean, there are all these theories, like maybe the people who did the shepherding hated the people who were farmers, so they didn't want to mix. No one really knows. So that's true of a lot of these laws. But I was like, I'm following him. I don't care. And stoning adulterers. I did stone adulterers with a very small stone,
You
like a
stone
pebble.
adulterers. You refused to sit on the same chairs as your wife while she was menstruating.
Exactly. That's in there too. It became impure. And the idea was follow everything without picking and choosing, sort of become the ultimate fundamentalist literalist to see what works and what doesn't. To see at the end what I thought of religion, what I thought of the Bible, what I could take with me to make my life better, which it did have, like gratitude and various other things that did improve my life. So I thought, I'm like, you know what? I need to do a sequel because the Constitution I knew very little about. And yet, every day for the last 5 years, it's in the headlines. This 230-year-old document has a huge impact on my life, on millions of other lives, on how we live, who we marry. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I am going to try to understand the Constitution by following the original meaning from 1789. So I did. I bore a musket, an 18th century musket around New York City.
Now, did you need a special permit for that? So you carried a musket around with you. Now, guns are like open carry guns. I don't even know if that's considered an open carry gun, but is that legal in New York City?
Well, I found a little loophole on that one because it is considered an antique until it's loaded. Then it becomes a weapon. So had an unloaded musket. So if anyone tried to mug me, it would not have done much good. But I did eventually go and shoot it at a shooting range with some reenactors. But that was just one part. I also gave up social media and instead wrote pamphlets with a quill pen and handed them out on the street. And I applied to Congress to become a legal pirate, as is my constitutional right. So all of these things. And the whole idea was at the end, hopefully I would be more empowered. I would know and understand when people brought up the Constitution what the real truth was. And I do believe I became that. That was, I feel, much better. And I also wanted to know, should I be optimistic about democracy? Are we really in trouble? Is this the end? And so that's the point. I hope readers, when they read it, that they will feel empowered and hopefully optimistic. Not to do a spoiler, but I am more optimistic about democracy than I was.
Well, when reading your book, there's two things I noticed. One is, well, actually, first I want to ask you. So, in Article One of the Constitution, so the first article, which describes how Congress is made and how it works and what powers they have, I think it's Article One or Article
Yeah,
Two. I don't know.
that's it.
It talks about you could Congress can appoint people to privateer to basically be a pirate. I did not know this about the Constitution.
Yeah, it's not very well known. I mean, most people have not read the Constitution. That's according to polls. And so I first had to sit down and read it. And there were these parts that were super inspiring, like about equal protection and the common good. But then there are parts that are like, what? And it was written in the 18th century. And then privateers, which are legal pirates, were a huge deal because in the Revolution, America had no navy, very little navy, so they outsourced it. They said, if you're a fisherman, a private citizen, and want to put a cannon on your boat and go chase down British ships and keep all of the merchandise, the booty, then you can do that, and we will grant you permission. And it's still in the Constitution. There's not been a legal pirate since 1815. They haven't but I'm like, this is my job. I am trying to follow the real literal Constitution, and it's still in there. So I actually met with a congressman, Ro Khanna, and I presented him with my application. The official term is letter of marque and reprisal. And I had on my tricorn hat and I had the whole deal. He was at first interested. He was psyched because he's like, let's make this happen. Then when I explained to him exactly, like I would be going out on my friend's water ski boat to like attack ships in the Taiwan Straits or whatever. he was like, okay, let's slow down. Let's slow down. Maybe this is not. So I'm still waiting for it to be approved. But the point was to try to show there are all these parts of the Constitution we don't know about. Everyone says they know what the Constitution says, but we really don't, or I certainly didn't, and most people haven't even read it.
Well, look at all the confusion in 2020. Like, what happens if a president and vice president, or if their electors are not, ratified in time of the inauguration? Nobody really knew the answer.
No. Well, the Constitution is only 4 pages long. I mean, they're big pages with small writing, but it only takes 20 minutes to read. And so you cannot fit into 4 pages all of the thousands, millions of scenarios that are going to come up. So that is why there are always going to be these debates. And the question is, who decides it? Is it the Supreme Court, which is what we have now, these 9 unelected people? As you can tell from the way I phrased that, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that 9 unelected people can tell us what is in the Constitution and what is not. I think the founders did not intend for that to happen either.
Are you sure? Because look, at least the Federalists were a little bit nervous about democracy, right? They didn't want everybody, with a farm or whatever to decide the future of the world. They wanted themselves and people like themselves to decide the future of the world. Hence the Electoral College, hence the Senate. So I think the interesting thing about the Constitution, and a lot of it, which I read in the book, was how amorphous the document was. Like that 4 pages basically defined a system of making laws that has lasted and survived and flourished for the past, 250. How many years is it now? I don't even know.
230 plus, yeah.
Yeah, 230 years. So with all the problems, it's survived and it's worked. But the other thing is how many things I didn't know were actually debated. Like, I didn't know it was debated. Hey, let's get rid of all states, for instance.
Oh, yeah, that was interesting. Alexander Hamilton, at one point in the Constitutional Convention, said, maybe these states are a bad idea. It's confusing. Why should we have 2 different governments? And he later said he was sort of just kidding. He was misunderstood. But just to go back to a couple of your points really quickly. One, you're absolutely right. They were afraid back then of what they called the mob, which is pure democracy. So they built in these sort of majoritarian systems like the Electoral College. But at the same time, they did not want the Supreme Court to be as powerful as it was. Congress was the number one. Congress was first among equals. Congress had all the power. And the president was much weaker, and the Supreme Court was much weaker. So if they came back now, they would be like, "What? The Supreme Court has final say, and the president is doing hundreds of executive orders every year." So we do not live in a very originalist America. It's for better or worse. And I think that in some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse. This is a very different system than the one the founders envisioned.
But who would destroy? Like, let's say a law was passed and it was unconstitutional, as has often happened. Who would decide? It doesn't seem specified who would decide that something was unconstitutional. It makes sense that a court would decide it.
Well, you're right. It doesn't say. And in the beginning, and this is a lot from a great professor named Jonathan Gnapp at Stanford, it was much more all 3 branches would weigh in, but it was never assumed that, and Supreme Court had judicial review, so they would weigh in, but it was never assumed that they were the end all be all, that they had the final say. And so, yeah, the founders would be quite shocked by what is happening today.
But I could see how it could be extrapolated out that, look, the Constitution is a legal document that specifies laws. For instance, you're breaking the law if you don't allow someone to have freedom of speech. You're breaking the law according to the Constitution. And since the Supreme Court is the supreme arbiter of the law, it makes sense that they are the final say in terms of interpreting the Constitution.
Well, it makes sense to us now, but it is not the way that it was originally. When there was the case, John Marshall is known as a guy who kind of very early on, he was a chief justice, and he was one of the ones who said the Supreme Court has the power to say what's constitutional. But he only overturned one law from Congress, and there were none overturned for decades. Now the Supreme Court regularly overturns laws. So it is quite a shocking difference.
Take a quick break. If you like this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it. It would mean so much to me. Please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast. Email me at altucher@gmail.com and tell me why you subscribed. Thanks. I have to say, Airbnb has changed my life. I just love staying in Airbnbs. Like in about a month, I'm going to Cocoa Beach, which is right next to Cape Canaveral. I'm going to watch some rocket launches. I'm going to, of course, be staying in a very nice Airbnb on the beach. And it's just such a great experience. Like the whole world is available to us now because of Airbnb. But whenever I'm at an Airbnb, I always realize, the home that I left to come to this Airbnb, I could be making money on that right now by hosting and being an Airbnb myself. So, and I've known people, I had a friend who basically, made a living from turning his home into an Airbnb. So if you have a home, but you're not always at home, you do have an Airbnb there. And it can easily fit into your lifestyle, and it's a great way to earn some money. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. I remember last year I was asked to go speak at the Norway Business Summit, and I was so excited because side by side with the Business Summit was the Norway Chess Summit, where I would get to see in person Magnus Carlsen, the best chess player ever, playing chess. But it was 4 plane rides, like to get to the city that ultimately I would go to. So I really did not want to fly for 14 hours, and they were willing to pay for everything for me. So I at first class. So I didn't want to fly for 14 hours and not be first class. So I had to hurry up and get on the phone immediately to get those first class tickets to a chess tournament in Norway. And listen, this is just like when, you have to know when you want the best of anything, you have to act quickly or someone else will get it instead. And I did not want those seats to fill up. So it's like if you're hiring for your business, you want to find the most talented people for your open roles before the competition scoops them up. I just was talking to a friend this morning where he was trying to decide between some programmers, and he waited a little too long, and both the programmers he was interviewing took other jobs, like great jobs. So, what's the best way then to hire the best as quickly as possible? ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter finds qualified candidates fast. And right now, you could try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/James. Just try it and see. You'll find out. So ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology takes center stage to identify the top talent for your roles. Immediately after you post your job, ZipRecruiter's smart technology starts showing you qualified people for it. And I know this because one time I signed up as an potential employee on ZipRecruiter, and I got nonstop. Even though obviously I wasn't looking for a job, I love what I do, but I just wanted to see what would happen because they were a sponsor of my podcast. And the most interesting jobs would pop up in my emails like, hey, you're qualified for this or that. And so it's interesting to see. So just go there and try it. Try ZipRecruiter.com/James. Amp up your hiring performance. Now, this is more for if you're hiring, but amp up your hiring performance with ZipRecruiter and find the best fast. See why 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Just go to this exclusive web address right now to try ZipRecruiter for free. ZipRecruiter.com/James. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/James. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Not to dive into the weeds of history, but like take the Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams passed. Basically said you weren't allowed to criticize government or you can go to jail. And he'd use that to put like journalists in jail.
Yeah.
So that's clearly unconstitutional. It's against the First Amendment, freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Who would then decide that he was that was unconstitutional?
Well, that was never overturned by the Supreme Court. It lapsed, but let me tell you, this is interesting because I love free speech. I am a huge fan of free speech, as you know, as you are, but we do not love the original conception of free speech. We love 20th century free speech. We love the free speech at the beginning of our country was very much constricted, and it wasn't quite Stalinist Russia, but it was nothing like we have today.
Like what was different?
And
You mentioned in the book about blasphemy, but tell me what's different.
well, that's a huge one. I mean, the state laws against blasphemy were considered constitutional because the idea was you had a right to free speech, but the government also had a right to punish you if your speech was dangerous to the republic. So they had a much less absolute view of rights. And this is from Judd Campbell, a great professor also at Stanford. So you could be, I instituted it in my house because I was trying to get back to the original. So I have teenage kids and I'm like, if you curse or blaspheme, I'm going to fine you 37.5 cents, which is what it cost in 1789 in New York State. And they would curse and I'd say, put in 37.5 cents into the jar. Then they would curse. They say, oh, I don't have a half cent. And then they would curse again. And I say, all right, now put in 75. Then they would curse on purpose just to get back to the half cent. So that didn't work out. But the idea is blasphemy was, laws against blasphemy by states were considered constitutional. And John Adams, like you said, sedition, his party, the Federalists, thought it was constitutional. We see it as incredibly unconstitutional now, and I am very glad of that. But back then, the argument was that free speech was not totally free. And my favorite one they threw in jail was a guy who made an ass joke. That's all he did. He made an arse. It was literally an arse joke. John Adams came and there was a big celebration in Boston and they shot some cannons. And this guy was at a tavern and he said, I wish one of the cannonballs would go through John Adams' arse. And someone overheard him, reported him to the police, and he was thrown in jail.
So the question is, what would you be allowed? Like, what right did it protect that would have been on the fence otherwise? The First Amendment.
Well, it depends again on who you're talking about. The Federalists, like John Adams, would want you to be able to write an editorial in the newspaper, but a polite one, nothing attacking, the body shaming John Adams, which was big back then. They called him his rotundity. But yes, a polite editorial and some vigorous discussion in the tavern, that was allowed. Now, there were others who were a little more pro-free speech, like Thomas Jefferson. He was okay with sort of more demonstrations. He might be okay with people marching in the streets. But I am very glad for, weirdly, the Jehovah's Witnesses. I talk about this in the book. Thank you, Jehovah's Witnesses, because they filed in the 40s and 50s dozens of suits against expanding our free speech, and they all went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses that they could do things like not say the Pledge of Allegiance. They could do things like say on the street corner, that regular Christianity was terrible. And so thank you to Jehovah's Witnesses for
So,
our freedom of speech.
so if a kid right now doesn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance and the school punishes him, like let's say sends him to detention or suspends him or whatever, he can sue the school on his First Amendment rights.
I believe that's true. I'm not a First Amendment lawyer, so don't hire me for that. But I'm pretty sure that's true. You don't have to say the First Amendment anymore. I mean, the Pledge of Allegiance anymore. Thank
Now,
you.
if a state has
Jehovah's.
blasphemy laws, but then there's the First Amendment, who protects me first? Am I like, do I follow the state laws or does the First Amendment override that?
Well, now it does, but back then it didn't. So in the beginning of our country, states were much more powerful. And in fact, it was more like at the very beginning, it was more like the European Union. You were more likely to think of yourself as a New Yorker or a Georgian now than you were as an American. And the whole point of the Constitution was trying to bind people together more. But even back until much later, it was much weaker. And the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, not to states. So the federal government couldn't throw you in jail for saying, that John Adams is fat, but the state governments could.
So you couldn't say no. And this is where the Constitution. I mean, this is where the Supreme Court came along and said, no. Constitution overrides all that, and we decide.
Exactly, that is right. Thanks to the 14th Amendment.
But it's interesting how. Well, why the 14th Amendment?
Well, not to get too much into the weeds, but 14th Amendment came after the Civil War, and it says it's all about equal protection and due process and all of these things. And it has the famous one about the clause that says that if you engage in insurrection, you cannot be an officer. And that was what the whole Trump trial was about. So the 14th Amendment's got a lot going on. But one of the most famous parts is that it's equal protection, and that was interpreted to mean both the state and the federal government had to respect your rights. At the very beginning of our country, individual rights were not as big. It was more about state rights.
Interesting. So, and this is also related to this constitutional case recently between the Biden administration and Greg Abbott's administration in Texas, the governor of Texas.
Right.
And the Supreme Court ruled, hey, federal overrides state.
Right. Thank God. I agree. I am in favor of that. But that is a big deal. And in the beginning of our country, it might have been more of a fight.
Now, the presidency has changed quite a bit. Like if you look at the Constitution, the president has very few powers. He can't make laws. He can just suggest laws. And he can also negotiate peace treaties, but they're not useful until Congress passes the peace treaty. And he can throw state parties and go to funerals, but that's basically it. He's commander of the armies, which is important too. So I shouldn't leave that. But those are like his only rights in the Constitution.
It was a much weaker presidency at the beginning. And as you know, in my book, The Year of Living Constitutionally, I tried to express all my rights. So I had the musket. I also wanted to express my right to petition. And because that was a big deal back then. So did you sign it? I had a quill and I
did not, unfortunately.
Well, and then I brought it to Congress. I brought it to an actual senator and rolled it out in front of him. But the point of the petition was that the president has become way too powerful. As you said, in the constitutional times, George Washington, he did 8 executive orders in his 8 years. Obama and Trump both did hundreds. And so it's not just Democrat or Republican. And war powers, it used to be Congress declared war, and then the president would execute the war. But now, president drives the whole train. Same with trade law. So I think this is a serious problem. And I think the founders would be like, what? The president is like, now this is what is fascinating to me. When the idea came up in the Constitutional Convention, they're like debating all these wacky ideas. someone said, well, let's have a single president. Like they all wanted an executive branch, but how is it going to be organized? This one guy says, well, let's have a single president. Several other delegates say, are you insane? We just fought a bloody war to get rid of a king, and you want to replace him with an elected king with one person? That's terrible. So it was a big debate. Instead, they said, we'll have 3 presidents, 3 co-presidents. So imagine Biden, Trump, and RFK Jr. all hanging out in the Oval Office,
Oh my gosh.
co-working. And Ben Franklin suggested 12 presidents. Can you imagine 12? Air Force 12? So it was overruled, and we do have one president, which is probably good. But the problem is there are a few guardrails on the president's power, and he's just taken more and more power over the years. And so this petition was, let's rethink the 3 presidents. Maybe we should have 3 presidents again. I don't honestly want 3 presidents, but I wanted to bring up the idea that when the idea of one president came up, one of the delegates said, that is the fetus of monarchy. That's like a baby monarch. We do not want that. And my point is, that fetus is now like a tween or an adolescent. Like it is scary. So
Because-
that is what, go ahead.
Like the whole idea of an executive order is a law that wasn't passed by Congress.
Right. And yeah, it is, they call it the imperial presidency, and it's been a problem since the 70s. Arthur Schlesinger, a great writer, brought
Since
it up
Roosevelt.
in the 70s.
I mean, Roosevelt created all these new parts of the executive branch that made laws.
Yeah, well, you know what? You are right. It does go back much farther. Lincoln, some of my favorite presidents expanded presidential power in scary ways. Lincoln during the Civil War and FDR.
Oh, yeah. Oh, but that's an interesting question. So Lincoln, it's not really clear about secession, right, in the Constitution. So it could be that the case, I've seen it argued that the Civil War, like maybe you're allowed to have states to secede instead of go to war with them. Like that, I think that was unclear.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to encourage any secession in this this day and age. I would say the Constitution said don't secede. You can succeed. Don't secede.
Right. So the Constitution says don't secede or whatever it says, but Lincoln technically went against that. Is what you were saying, right?
Well, no, I was saying he went overreached in several ways, including, I believe, that he suspended habeas corpus in some cases, and I believe he also he was very severe on the press and censoring the press during wartime. So these are examples of some of my favorite presidents, but taking on sort of this semi-authoritarian power. The problem was when the Civil War was over, it's not like the Congress got back those powers. The president kept them. So now we have this, and the founders had ideas on how to stop this that maybe we should think about again. We have they wanted a cabinet that was like a supercharged, powerful cabinet that could veto the president, basically. So imagine that if the president had to get permission from his cabinet, and it's a problem. I mean, they also proposed maybe a more parliamentary system. So we have a presidential system, and the other big one is a parliamentary system, where the president or head of state is elected by Congress. So it's not directly elected. People elect Congress. Congress elects the head of state or the head of government, and then they can kick him out. It's much easier to kick him out if the Congress is the one who elected him.
Yeah, so they debated that, but why did they decide against it?
That's a great question. There were people who said that it would do the opposite, that if it was the Congress elected the president, then the president could team with Congress and just take more and more power away from the states, for instance. So they decided in the end, no, we need more separation of power. So that was the key. Like you have 3, it was sort of rock, paper, scissors. You have each area, and they each can sort of balance against each other.
So do you think that separation of powers part is pretty important, and that's what avoids a king in some sense? So perhaps, so we see examples of the Supreme Court taking more power. We saw example of the presidency taking more power. Maybe this was required to keep that separation of powers because Congress had so much power.
That is a very interesting point. And just one side note on that, that's one of my favorite parts of this whole project is that the founders had huge flaws. I mean, they were racist, sexist, horrible hypocrites in many ways. But one virtue that I do think they had is they were more open-minded. They did change their minds more. And in fact, James Madison, founder of the Constitution, his last words on his deathbed, he was on his deathbed, his niece sees him change he makes a weird face. And she says, "Uncle, what's wrong?" And he said, "Oh, nothing. I just changed my mind." And then he died. So we don't know. Did he change his mind about Congress or about the balance of powers or about the wallpaper? We'll never know. But the point is, he was changing his mind right up until his last moments. And a lot of the founders did that too. Ben Franklin was a big fan of changing his mind. So that's it.
And
Okay.
they were very big compromisers.
Right. And which we wouldn't have a country without it. Now, compromise, I mean, it's a complicated one, and I don't know the answer to this because the most notorious compromise was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which allowed slavery to continue and gave the slave states a lot more power. And the fear was that if they didn't do this, the southern states would just walk and we would not have a United States. Maybe that would have been better. Maybe it would have been better to split it up. I don't know the answer, but there were many times compromise was good. I do believe that there were ways that if they had been totally rigid, there was no way we were going to have a country at all.
Go spread the word. When you get a fresh hot McCrispy from McDonald's and you can feel the heat coming through the bag, don't try to wait till you get home. Always respect hot chicken. The McCrispy, only at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
From pit lane to podium, the Las Vegas Grand Prix is providing fans a race day experience at the speed they deserve. With the help of T-Mobile for Business, our 5G advanced network solutions are powering race day operations with event-wide connectivity. From streamlined gate entry to an immersive app, giving fans blazing fast access to the sport they love. This is accelerating innovation. This is the Las Vegas Grand Prix with T-Mobile for Business. Take your business further at T-Mobile.com/now.
Let me ask you a question. Why have a country? So the Revolutionary War had ended, I don't know, 1783. I always thought when I was a kid it was 1776, but it lasted another 6 or 7 years. And then George Washington is not elected president until what, like 70? It doesn't become president until 1789.
Right.
And there was still a country. It was like a confederation then.
Yeah.
And what was wrong? I mean, I don't know anything about it, actually.
I love that question because that's the kind of thing we need to go back to the basics and say, why do we have it set up this way? And is there a better way to set it up? I actually think that a country is a good idea because what they had before the Constitution, they had the Articles of Confederation. And this was pretty much, like we talked about, every state was almost its own country. So they would have their own trade laws. They would have their own money. They had their own military. And the fear was if a European power tried to attack the United States, some of them would make a treaty with, they had their own treaty making power. And some would make a treaty with that country and others wouldn't. And there's no unified front. There's no way. And also taxes. There was no way for the federal government to have taxes because the states were the ones who had taxes. So if you do believe, and I know some people don't, that it's good to have a federal government that can then make an interstate highway system, for instance, then that was never going to happen under the Articles of Confederation. And so the theory was it was like splitting up, that, this was just chaos and it was about to fall apart. I did talk to some scholars who said maybe it wouldn't have been bad to have 13 different countries or 50 different countries. Maybe that is a better system. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that, but it's a great question. I mean, that was what I love, going into this with a beginner's mind and saying, why do we have what we have, and is it the best system?
But clearly all the states did ultimately think to themselves, hey, we should all form a tighter bond. And hence they all voted for the Constitution ultimately.
Ultimately, but not, it was a big fight. I mean, some of them were very upset. It was called the Anti-Federalist movement. They were very against the idea of uniting, because sometimes they would have trade wars, like New York and New Jersey would have trade wars, and they would try to tax the other one out of existence. So they were not friends. They were frenemies at best. So the idea, when these 55 delegates went to Philadelphia to hammer out a constitution, most of the states thought, oh, they're just going to tweak the Articles of Confederation. They're just going to tweak it a little, maybe give us a tiny bit more power. And they're like, no, we're throwing it away and starting again and creating a country. And when they got out, people were like, what? That is crazy. And it took a lot of campaigning on the part. That's what the Federalist Papers are, that where Hamilton and John Jay and Madison wrote these brilliant essays defending the Constitution and why we needed it. But not everyone was convinced.
And it was Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison?
Yeah, they wrote the Federalist Papers.
And meanwhile,
the
Anti-Federalist was like Thomas Jefferson, right?
No, he was in favor of the Constitution, even though, you're right, he wanted stronger states. He said when he was in France when the Constitution was written, and he said in a letter, there are parts of this that I love and parts of this that I hate. But it was already done by the time he came back. So he didn't have much of a say, and he said, on the whole, I would rather have the Constitution than not.
I wonder if he felt like fear of missing out. Like he's like, oh my gosh, I wrote the Declaration of Independence, and now they're writing the Constitution without me?
I totally think he had FOMO. I mean, he called the group who gathered in Philadelphia, he called them demigods. And he must have been like, I'm a demigod too. I could have been there. I could have made it better. So yeah, it is fascinating who showed up and who didn't.
You know, it's interesting. The last legally declared war was World War II. Like, Congress did vote for that war, and Roosevelt declared it, but Congress actually voted for it. Congress hasn't voted for a single war since, but somehow there's been the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all the conflicts we've had, Iraq a bunch of times. Like, there's been tons of wars since World War II, but that's because the presidency does it through these executive orders.
Right. The president has gained war power, and the Congress is occasionally trying to take it back with various war power acts. But still, the president has a tremendous amount of power. And I talk about that. I have a section on war. I break the book up into different sections. So there's one on free speech and one on housing soldiers and one on war. And for that, I joined the 3rd New Jersey Regiment of Revolutionary War reenactors and went out with my musket and fought in the Battle of Monmouth and died, by the way. I died for my fake country, or fake died for my country. And that is where I get into this, how different war was at the start of our country.
And you also mentioned in the book about all these new government, executive branch agencies like the FDA, as an example, that weren't they weren't created by constitutional amendment, and yet they seem to have the power to create laws. Like the FDA could decide what food you can eat.
Right. And this is a huge deal in the Supreme Court because the conservatives or libertarians want to roll back these federal agencies and their power. And the more progressive side says, no, we need to, otherwise our food would have lead in it. We'd all be dead. So it's whether you see red tape as strangling small business, which is sort of the libertarian, or is red tape like what's saving us from falling off into the canyon? So is it protective and good for society, or is it bad for society? And that is a huge split.
I mean, like with all these things, it's probably a little bit in the middle. Like
Right. I
if you look
agree.
at like, you have to get you have to pay a fee to get, for instance, a license to polish nails for a living.
Mm,
And so
right.
so some people say that maybe this is like this overregulation is a tax on the poor because it affects, like for instance, this over licensing affects mostly people in poor occupations. And but then there's the flip argument, which is that okay, but they use chemicals in nail polish and people should be regulated, and the Congress has to take care of people because they can't take care of themselves. And so there's that other argument.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a complicated one. I mean, that, and also that's what I love is that there's no easy answers, and that you have to look at issues through multiple lenses. So you probably know the fox and the hedgehog. You know that whole. Oh, it's
uh,
a parable by the writer Isaiah Berlin, and he says there are two kinds of people in the world. There are the hedgehogs who see the world all through one lens. So whether that's Marxism or uh, or religion, everything is filtered through one lens. The fox has many lenses. So they look at it from one angle and then another. They look at it from a religious angle, and an animal angle, an animal rights angle, even it could be a capitalism angle. All these different ways, and then they're much more nuanced and gray thinkers instead of black and white. And I actually think both approaches are important, but I am much more of the fox. I believe you have to look at things uh, and differently because nothing is black and white. And I think that way about regulation. There are some areas where we are way overregulated. And Ezra Klein, super progressive guy, like he's always railing about overregulation in the building uh, sector. But on the other hand, like just having no regulation, we would all die of lead poisoning. I think it would be terrible.
yeah,
Not we would not all die. That was a hedgehog thing to say. So a lot of people might die.
but it's a good point, and I think this is what makes the Constitution so powerful is that it fits all of these perspectives, like so that it can become an argument. It's not just de facto decided by this one document that's 230 years old. This document allowed us to mold a government. Like we can say the president took more powers, the Supreme Court took more powers, the Congress took more, but the reality is it's evolved. There's been small changes here and there, and altogether it's created this evolved set of mutations in government that so far, knock on wood, has worked out. Meaning, not that it's so great, but that we've survived and
Right.
flourished as a country.
Well, I would say yes, we have survived, and I would agree. The Constitution is an amazing document, and part of its power is that it had these vague phrases like equal protection, and you had to argue about what that meant. But I still think there are so many reforms that we need to do to make democracy better, and that some of these, either that have evolved or that were built into the Constitution, are actually bad for our democracy. For instance, we should have term limits on the Supreme Court. And most people on both sides of the aisle, you look at the polls, it's like, I don't know what it is, but it is
Yeah, why
way
don't
up.
they have term limits? Because uh, this way, it's not like they can get reappointed. It has to end. So there's
Yeah.
no kind of political jockeying, which avoids the real problem about. You don't want to always have an elected official because then there's political jockeying for whatever the latest trends are. But term limits would solve a lot of the issues you have with the Supreme
Oh,
Court.
yeah. And the founders wanted life tenure for the justices because they thought it would insulate them from politics and they could remain above and just look at the law. But that has not happened. And it is just a disaster. And we have people on, and now people live so much longer. We have people on for 40 years. It's not good. Like to have an 88-year-old ruling on internet technology, that's not a great thing. That is not something. If the founders understood what the internet was, they probably be like, that doesn't look good.
I think freedom of speech is still a moving target too. Like you mentioned at first, there was the blasphemy issue, but now there's also, what constitutes hate speech, I think is very unclear. And look,
Yeah.
there's been congressional testimonies on that even recently. And then, of course, a big issue is the role of democracy. Like you have the Electoral College is kind of the biggest challenge to pure democracy that's in the Constitution. And that, regardless of where you stand on that, that's a major issue that's kind of unresolved at the moment.
Oh, yeah. No, I am not a fan of the Electoral College. I mean, the irony of the Electoral College is that part of the reason the founders did it is because they thought this group of electors, like actual people, several people from a certain state, they were the ones who voted for president. So if the rabble, if the mob voted for a demagogue, some guy who is going to be a tyrant, then these intellectual, cool, reasoned electors could say, "Oh no, that we're not going to have a demagogue in the office," and then they would vote for the rational person. And what's happened is, arguably, the opposite, because you have someone who might lean towards demagoguery, and he is able to gain the presidency, even though he has a minority of the vote, of the popular vote, because of this electoral system. So I am not a fan. I think that if the founders knew what would have happened to elect the Electoral College, they would have figured out a different way. Part of it was they didn't have the technology. They didn't know how are 13 states from all over the seaboard going to get together and have thousands of people vote. It was just a logistical problem. It was much easier to have these electors do it.
So AJ, I know you're in a rush, so we're going to wrap this up, but we're going to do a part 2 where we're going to solve all the problems of the Constitution. We're going to brainstorm what your next book, do you have a topic for your next book?
No, I need some help.
We're going to brainstorm the topic
all
for your
right.
next book. And I'm going to have a very quick part 2 to this, which is to describe the AJ Jacobs method of writing a bestseller. It's how you combine experience with storytelling. You are the only person in the world who does it exactly the way you do it. It's very unique, and it's a genre all of its own. And I always am a big admirer of your work. We'll talk more about the Constitution. We'll have a part 3 of this after the book comes out, which is next week. But the year of living constitutionally, one man's humble quest to follow the Constitution's original meaning. AJ Jacobs, one of my favorite writers of all time. I've bookmarked the entire book. The stories are great. The knowledge is great. You'll learn a huge amount. If you love this country and this Constitution, you got to read AJ Jacobs' book. AJ, thank you so much.
Bless you, James. You are a great citizen, and I love your writing as well. Huzzah!
Thank you.
Go spread the word. When you get a fresh hot McCrispy from McDonald's and you can feel the heat coming through the bag, don't try to wait till you get home. Always respect hot chicken. The McCrispy, only at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
It's okay if you aren't ready for kids right now. It's okay if you don't want to be a mom now or even ever. It's nobody's decision but yours. But do you know what's not okay? Not knowing how effective your birth control is. Talk to your doctor about effective birth control options so you can make an informed decision. Tap to learn more.